The current housing market is not anything like 2008. And I know a lot of people think that, and you've heard all over YouTube and the news and different media outlets that we are headed for a 2008 style housing crash. But I've got news for you. I just don't see that happening. And if I hear another person equate right now to 2008, I might actually lose it. And in this video, I'm going to talk about how this current housing market is much more similar to the 1980s housing market and does not resemble 2008. I get why people might think that we're headed for a 2008 style crash. It was a huge global phenomenon, and quite frankly, people are probably pretty emotionally scarred from it. And there could be a few people out there that still haven't financially recovered. But that doesn't mean that what we're facing right now is the same. Let's look into the reasons why the market's not the same. But in order to do that, we need to examine what crashed the housing market in 2008. And it's really, really important to note that we are not facing that now. The most important thing is subprime loans, and we just don't see that. Most homeowners have a lot of equity in their homes, and I mean like a lot of equity in their homes. And if you have a lot of equity in your home, it's really, really difficult to be underwater, which means it's difficult to foreclose, which means it's difficult to lose your house. Yes, some people might lose their job with a potential upcoming recession, and there's always going to be people that fall on hard times, but typically people will do whatever they need to do in order to keep a roof over their head. And when you consider that the alternative to the home that they're in is either renting a house or buying a new house, both of those options are much more expensive than probably what their current mortgage payment is. I mean, if you think about anybody that bought before the pandemic, their interest rate is probably 3% or less, and their monthly payment is extremely manageable. Now, if they tried to go get a rental property because they can't afford their house, their monthly expense on housing is going to go up by 2 or 3 times. It really just doesn't make sense. So as I mentioned earlier, the big problem with 2008 was really a financial crisis that bled into the real estate sector. We had people that were getting stated income loans, which just meant they walked in and said,
"Hey, I make this amount of money, you should give me a loan."
and then the lenders went,
Okay, that sounds good.
that was a huge problem. We also don't have adjustable rate mortgages. I mean, we still have them and they're still an option, but they're not nearly as popular as they used to be, and for pretty good reason. It's because a lot of people got wiped out. And when we had the financial crisis in 2008, there was about 35% of the mortgages that were adjustable rate. And basically, those were just ticking time bombs waiting to explode. And they did. The other huge difference is that we don't have extreme amounts of new homes coming online into our inventory. In 2006, 7, and 8, we were building homes like crazy because people were buying. It's quite possible that builders still are feeling the burn of 2008 and the great financial collapse. In fact, a lot of home builders went bankrupt and they never came back. Besides building, there was also just a difference in the economy. For example, according to CNBC, household debt is at an all-time high, but 2008 was still worse, the report finds. And if we take a look at the report from CNBC, it even says, by some measures, Americans have never been more in the red. Total credit card debt surpassed $1 trillion for the first time this year, but after adjusting for inflation, a recent analysis by WaldHub found that US households were worse off during the 2008 financial crisis. Again, not to say that things are great right now with debt, because as we all know, credit card debt is at an all-time high, but when you account for inflation, 2008, the debt crisis was much worse. And that's just another factor in why I don't think we're going to have a 2008 style housing crash. Additionally, there's also this thing called demographics, and I'll touch on this later in the video, but the moral of the story is in 1980, baby boomers were between the ages of 20 and 30, and that's when they bought homes. And what we have right now is millennials who are between the age of 25 and 35. We have millennials coming online, and we even have Gen Zs that are starting to just barely get into their early 20s and maybe consider buying a house if they're in a fortunate position. Because we have so many people that want to buy homes and inventory stays so low, again, it's really difficult to have a crash in any asset or any commodity when the demand rate remains so high. In a recent article from Money Magazine, there was a great comparison between the market that we're in now and 1980. In that article, it talks about how inflation in the 1970s was running really rampant and it was getting really high. And according to the article, in the late 70s, the economy was facing a tough time. Inflation was running at about 14% thanks to two oil embargoes in the previous years that had sent consumer prices skyrocketing, including home prices. Nationally, home values increased 14% in 1979, although many markets saw prices grow more than 20%. It was a seller's market, and buyers were purchasing homes regardless of condition. Does this sound at all familiar? Geez, it kind of sounds like 2021, 2022, and 2023. It's kind of strange. Enter the Federal Reserve, which started raising interest rates to bring inflation back under control. And by the time that the story was written, mortgage rates had surged to 15%, a huge jump given the rates averaged between 8 and 10% from 73 to 78. Many buyers couldn't afford the higher mortgage payments. And again, we're starting to see a lot of similarities between 1980 and the current market we're in now in the end of 2023. We don't have any oil embargoes, at least not right now or not yet, but we had the pandemic and it was a major economic event. People could not go to work, government shut down, people were very afraid, and we even entered a very small recession for about 2 months. Back in 1980, when the Fed increased interest rates to almost 19%, what followed was a recession. And of course, everybody thinks that a recession is the worst possible thing that can happen. Well, recessions are quite normal and they're actually kind of routine and they're pretty cyclical. So it shouldn't be that big of a concern that when interest rates shoot up, there's a recession. But what does that mean for home prices? So what did happen with housing prices in the 1980s and the years to follow? And if we're in a really similar spot, maybe we can help draw some conclusions, some parallels from the position that we were in to the position that we're in now and will be for the next 1 to 2 years. Let's take a look. In quarter 3 of 1979, the median sales price was $64,700. And after a recession, in quarter 1 of 1983, that median sales price went to $73,300. Now, you tell me if that's a crash. That was a very classic example of a very normal recession, and home prices did not crash. And this is basically exactly what we're seeing today. The recession in 1980 didn't tank home prices, and even if we do come across a recession in 2024, it is not going to take home prices then either. In the last 50 years and the roughly 8 recessions we've had, we've only had one recession crash housing prices. All other recessions saw home prices either increase or stay stable at worst, which that's why real estate and homeownership is a great investment. I will say that there is one marked difference between the 1980s housing market and today's housing market, and that is the big I word, interest. And interest rates are definitely different. If we look back in the 1980s, before that recession started and before the Fed really turned up the interest rate dial, interest rates were at about 7.5%, 8%. And in 2020, with millennials, well, we saw interest rates hover between 3% and 4%. It was a huge difference. And when interest rates shot up even to 7 or 8%, like where they are now, millennials are shocked and they feel like nothing is affordable. They don't feel like they can buy a home. However, I have a challenge for you. Go talk to your parents. Ask them, when they bought a home, if they were fortunate enough to buy a home in the 80s, how did they feel? How did they feel financially? Did they feel stretched? Did they feel like the payment was huge? Did they feel like they weren't going to be able to do it? They probably did. Some home buyers bought homes and couldn't afford to furnish them for a year. There were empty rooms in homes that they couldn't afford to put any beds in or couches in or TVs in because they were strapped for cash. We look back as millennials and think, oh man, our parents had it so great. They were able to buy affordable housing and now their mortgage payments are so low. I got news. You could be in that same position too. In fact, go back even further. Go back to your grandparents' generation. We've all heard the stories. I paid $12,000 for my home, or I paid $17,000 for my home. And of course, we all get very jealous of that, but ask them how they felt about their monthly payment. Ask them how they felt about their down payment. And chances are they're going to say the same exact thing. They felt cash strapped, they felt poor, they felt like they couldn't do it, but they made sacrifices, they made lifestyle changes, and guess what? they're able to do it too. For those of you watching this video that did buy a home in that time, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments, did you buy a home in the 1980s? How did you feel with your payment? How did you feel with the down payment? Did you feel like you were strapped for cash? I'd love to know. So are we gonna go into a recession? Well, of course, it's really hard to know and nobody knows for sure, but there's a couple things we need to keep in mind. During a recession, interest rates typically trend downward. Recessions are common and they're normal and they're cyclical. However, we haven't seen a recession in about 14 years. That could be a little bit of psychology at play, and people just aren't familiar with a recession lifestyle, and especially young home buyers. And the last recession we had, I was in high school or early college, and quite frankly, I didn't really care about a recession at that time because I didn't have any money to care about a recession at that time. Also, recessions can present some great long-term investment opportunities. And of course, if you haven't figured out by now, I think one of the best long-term investment opportunities is a home. Homes were never meant to be short-term investments. And I tell my buyer clients all the time, a great way to lose money on real estate is to buy and sell a house within 7 years. The only time that hasn't rang true is in the unicorn years of the pandemic, when we were seeing 15 and 20% price increases over the course of 2020, 2021, and into early 2022. But that's completely abnormal and definitely not something that we're probably ever gonna see again. Of course, nobody knows what's gonna happen and nobody has a crystal ball. So we'll just have to wait and find out and see what happens. If you like this video, check out this video right over here to learn more about real estate. I'll see you guys on the next one.